Okay, so forget the stoic face on the corner. Like, totally forget it.
All right.
Forget the guy in the paintings, calmly crossing the Delaware River looking like an absolute superhero.
The Marble Man.
Exactly, the Marble Man. What if I told you that the commander of the American Revolution literally wept, like in actual terror, at the thought of being exposed as an absolute fraud?
It's wild to think about.
It really is, because, for anyone out there who identifies as a learner, someone who navigates high stakes expectations in your own life or your career, you are going to find George Washington's crippling imposter syndrome incredibly familiar.
Oh, absolutely. It completely reframes how you look at the founding of the country, honestly.
Yeah,
Because when you step away from the mythology and you dive into the actual primary source,
that is what we're doing today.
right, the private letters, the diaries, the raw, chaotic reality of the American Revolution, that unbreakable marble just shatters.
He really does.
You find a psychological landscape that is, well, it's highly volatile. It's deeply insecure and, frankly, explosive.
Okay, let's unpack this, because for this deep dive, we are completely throwing out that demigod narrative.
Yeah, good riddance to it.
Right. We have a massive stack of sources here covering a very specific, very intense period, 1775 to 1783.
The entirety of the Revolutionary War.
Exactly, the crucible of command. So our mission today is to deconstruct that myth and look at the actual human being. We're talking about a leader who was plagued by self-doubt, volcanic rage, and some really agonizing moral compromises.
Which, I mean, makes for a much more compelling story anyway.
Oh, totally.
Because you have to remember, he was a provincial Virginia planter. He had a pretty spotty, mixed military record from the French and Indian War.
Yeah, it wasn't stellar.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And suddenly, he's tasked with defeating the greatest, most well-funded imperial power on Earth.
Right.
He didn't possess some, supernatural confidence. He was terrified.
Terrified is definitely the word. Like, the very first massive revelation in these sources is just how deeply he suffered from what we would now diagnose as imposter syndrome.
Textbook imposter syndrome.
Right. I mean, think about a modern executive stepping into a role they secretly feel totally unqualified for, and they're just constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. That was Washington in 1775.
Yeah, the modern psychological framework of the imposter phenomena fits him perfectly. That internal gnawing experience of feeling like a fraud despite outward success.
Right.
Because, I mean, she had very little formal education.
Which people forget.
They do.
Yeah.
And he'd never commanded a large standardized body of regular troops. He didn't understand cavalry. He didn't really understand artillery. And suddenly he's managing the logistical nightmare of a continental war spread across thousands of miles.
There is this quote to Patrick Henry right after he accepts the commission from Congress, and it just stopped me in my tracks when I read it.
Oh, the one about his reputation.
Yes. He literally had tears in his eyes, according to the accounts, and he says, "Remember, Mr. Henry, what I now tell you, from the day I enter upon the command of the American armies, I date my fall and the ruin of my reputation."
Wow.
I mean, he was essentially declaring himself a dead man walking, socially speaking.
Yeah. And to really grasp the weight of that,
Yeah.
we have to look at the cultural mechanics of the 18th century Virginia gentry.
Right, the honor culture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In that culture, your reputation wasn't just like good PR or personal branding.
Yeah.
It was your core identity. It was your credit, your social standing, your very existence. To lose your reputation was to face total social annihilation.
So that quote to Patrick Henry, it's not performative.
Not at all.
It's not like, oh, look how humble I am, right?
Right. It's not political theater. It is genuine, catastrophic fear.
Yeah.
He was stepping onto a stage where he believed public disgrace was practically a mathematical certainty.
Which explains his desperate need for feedback. Like, he wasn't projecting this aura of knowing everything. He's writing to his confidant, his aide, Joseph Reed, practically begging for constructive criticism.
Literally.
He's saying, tell me my errors, I need to correct my faults. And the sources say he was secretly reading European military manuals late at night in his tent.
Trying to cram for the test, basically.
Exactly, just trying to bridge this massive gap in his knowledge before anyone noticed.
And that profound anxiety, it didn't just stay in the background, it compounded into severe clinical depression.
Especially later on, right?
Yeah, most acutely during the Valley Forge winter of 1777 to 1778.
Oh man, Valley Forge.
The sources paint a picture of a man who is trapped in a systemic collapse. Congress wasn't sending money.
Right.
The logistics chain was completely broken. His men were literally freezing and starving to death.
He wrote to Congress warning that the army would starve, dissolve, or disperse.
Starve, dissolve, or disperse.
Yeah.
Every single day of that winter validated his deepest, darkest fear. The fear that he was presiding over a total, very public ruin.
So how does a man with that much internal pressure, right, that much bottled up anxiety and literal depression, how does he react when things actually do fall apart on the battlefield?
Well, not well.
Right, because the sources show it wasn't with a stoic, stiff upper lip. The man was a volcano.
We really have to redefine what his stoicism actually was.
Okay, how so?
Because it wasn't an absence of emotion. It was a fragile, heavily fortified dam holding back a massive reservoir of intense aggression and passion.
Wow.
When his men failed to meet his standards, when they exposed him to that ruin he dreaded, the dam completely broke. The mechanisms of his self-control would just snap.
And we see this so vividly at the disaster at Kips Bay in New York.
Oh, Kips Bay, yeah.
This is in 1776. I want to paint this picture for the listener because it is wild. So the British are landing. They're firing these massive naval bombardments, and the American militia just breaks. I mean, they flee in absolute panic before the British infantry have even really engaged them.
Just total chaos.
And Washington loses his mind.
He completely loses it. The psychological shock of seeing his army disintegrate just shattered his composure.
Yeah.
He doesn't issue calm orders to regroup. He rides directly into the chaotic retreat, draws his sword, and begins physically striking his own fleeing soldiers and officers.
Beating them with his riding crop.
Yes, beating them. He throws his hat on the ground in sheer, unfiltered disgust.
But the part that really chills me and where you really see the psychological depth of this deep dive is what happens next.
Right.
After the screaming, after the striking, he just sits there.
He freezes.
He sits totally frozen on his horse, mere yards from the advancing Hessian and British infantry, completely exposed to musket fire.
Yeah.
And his aides, including Joseph Reed, who I mentioned earlier, they literally had to ride up, grab the reins of his horse, and physically drag the commander-in-chief away.
That specific detail is deeply, deeply revealing.
Tell me more about that, because it seems almost suicidal.
That's exactly what it was. That wasn't battlefield bravery. It wasn't, leading from the front.
Right.
If you analyze his psychological state in that moment, the sources suggest it was a subconscious desire for a martyred death over a disgraceful defeat.
Oh, wow.
He was so paralyzed by rage and the sudden physical materialization of his worst nightmare, his army running away, his reputation being destroyed, that he actually preferred to let a British musket ball end it right there.
Because a dead hero's reputation survived.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But a captured failed general's does not.
Man, that is heavy. And Kips Bay wasn't an isolated incident either.
No, not at all.
At the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, he rides up to find General Charles Lee ordering an unauthorized retreat.
Right.
And again, Washington just erupts. Lafayette, who idolized Washington, described it as a moment where he swore until the leaves shook on the trees.
Which is quite the image.
It is. He called Lee a damned poltroon, which, for the time, is basically calling a general a pathetic coward to his face in front of the entire army.
Yeah, he banished Lee to the rear on the spot and had him court-martialed eventually.
Jeez.
These eruptions are vital to understand because they show the sheer, exhausting willpower it took for Washington to maintain that calm exterior the other 99% of the time.
Which makes this next pivot in the sources so fascinating to me. Because we've got this guy who physically attacks his own men in a fit of uncontrollable rage on a chaotic battlefield.
Right.
But then when he faces cold, calculated political betrayal from his own ranks, when the enemy isn't shooting muskets, but they're writing letters in the halls of Congress, he completely flips the script.
You're referring to the Conway Cabal.
Exactly. So let's set the scene for this because honestly, it's a masterstroke of politics.
It really is.
In late 1777, Washington is freezing at Valley Forge. He's looking like an absolute failure because he just lost Philadelphia.
Right, the capital.
Meanwhile, his rival, General Horatio Gates, wins this massive war-altering victory at Saratoga.
The turning point of the war, as they say.
Yeah. So suddenly, politicians and rival officers start whispering. A brigadier general named Thomas Conway starts writing letters, basically calling Washington a weak, incompetent leader.
Right.
And Congress, which is already panicking, they even promote Conway to Inspector General, effectively to undermine Washington's authority.
What's fascinating here is the broader context of the war. because this was truly a two-front conflict for Washington.
How do you mean?
Well, Washington is fighting the British military, yes, but he's also fighting the political machinations of his own civilian government.
Oh, right.
He privately viewed many in Congress as bankrupt political zeros.
Political zeros. That's harsh.
It is, but they were broke, they were constantly second-guessing him, and they were desperate for a scapegoat. So Conway basically became the vector for all that congressional anxiety.
So how does the volcano react to this, existential political threat? Because he doesn't scream. He doesn't draw his sword. He executes an absolute masterclass in passive-aggressive political warfare.
It is brilliantly executed.
It's so funny. Tell us what he does.
So Washington finds out about these insulting letters through a drunken aide who blabs to someone in Washington's camp.
Classic.
Right. But instead of a Kips Bay-style explosion or, demanding a court-martial right away, Washington just sends Conway a single-sentence letter.
One sentence.
One sentence. He simply quotes the exact insult Conway wrote to Gates, adds absolutely no commentary of his own, and signs it, "Your humble servant."
I read that in the source and I literally laughed out loud. It is the 18th century equivalent of forwarding a screenshot to the group chat with no caption.
Yes.
Just letting the evidence sit there menacingly. But explain the mechanism here from a leadership perspective. Why is that more effective than getting angry?
Because of how it shifted the burden of action.
Okay.
By dragging the conspiracy into the light with zero explanation and zero demand for retribution, he forced all the conspirators into a panicked, uncoordinated defense.
Ah, I see.
If Washington had raged, right, and demanded Conway be fired, it would have looked tyrannical.
Yeah.
Congress would have pushed back.
They would have gotten defensive.
Exactly. But by just saying, "I know what you said," he let their own guilt and paranoia do all the work.
That is so smart.
Gates scrambled to explain himself and apologize. Conway's political support just evaporated because no one wanted to be openly associated with the plot once it was public knowledge.
Right, rats fleeing a sinking ship.
Exactly. Conway eventually resigned. Washington isolated them completely, proving he could compartmentalize his extreme paranoia and outmaneuver seasoned politicians entirely bloodlessly.
But, and this is a big but, that calculated restraint, it takes a very dark turn when we look at how he maintained military discipline with his own rank and file.
It certainly does.
Because I have to push back on this idea of him just being a clever, bloodless political operator. The sources detail some truly brutal moral compromises when it came to his own men.
You're thinking specifically about the Pompton Mutiny, aren't you?
I am. The Pompton Mutiny in 1781.
Yeah, that incident really strips away a lot of the romance of the revolution. It highlights the moral ambiguity that was absolutely required for systemic survival.
Right. Set the stage for us. What's happening in 81?
So by 1781, the army is starved, unpaid, and freezing again.
Always freezing.
Always. And the New Jersey Line mutinies at Pompton. Now, a few weeks earlier, Washington had actually shown some leniency to mutineers from the Pennsylvania line. He negotiated with them.
Okay.
But he quickly realized that continued appeasement would cause a domino effect. If every starving regiment mutinied for back pay, the entire Continental force would just collapse.
So the pragmatism kicks in.
Exactly.
And he abandons leniency completely. The sources say he sends 500 heavily armed, loyal troops to surround the starving mutineers in their camp.
In the dead of night.
He demands unconditional surrender, and his orders to the commander on the ground are chilling. He says to instantly execute the most active leaders, no trial, no negotiation.
And the mechanism of that execution is where the brutal psychological calculus really shows.
The part is so hard to read.
It is. He ordered a firing squad, but he mandated that the firing squad be made up of 12 of the mutineers' own co-conspirators.
He forced starving men to shoot their own starting leaders.
Yes. Sergeants Gilmore and Tuttle. He made their friends pull the triggers. And the historical accounts report that the firing squad was literally weeping as they fired.
So how do we reconcile this?
It's difficult.
Because the man who wept over his personal reputation, who begged for constructive criticism, who showed intense vulnerability in his private letters, is the exact same commander who coldly orders men to execute their friends just to maintain order.
You reconcile it by understanding his strict utilitarian morality.
Utilitarian morality.
Right. He ruthlessly subjugated empathy to the survival of the state. It was terror and psychological dominance applied with surgical precision to maintain the structural integrity of the rebellion.
Wow.
He used the same calculus when executing spies, like Major John Andre.
Oh, right, the British spy.
Exactly. It was never about personal sentiment or malice for Washington. It was a rigid application of military justice to protect operational security. Because in his mind, if the army fell apart, the nation died. Therefore, any action that kept the army together was morally justified.
Okay, but if we apply that utilitarian morality to an external enemy, it scales up to horrifying levels.
He does.
And the sources focus heavily on this. The Sullivan Expedition in 1779,
Yeah.
indigenous populations, specifically parts of the Iroquois Confederacy who were allied with the British, had been raiding the frontiers. And Washington's response wasn't just a military maneuver to secure the border, it was scorched earth.
It was the literal definition of total war.
Yeah.
Washington's orders to Major General John Sullivan explicitly called for the total destruction and devastation of their settlement.
Total destruction.
He didn't just want to defeat their warriors in battle, he ordered the ruin of their crops so they couldn't replant. And he explicitly told Sullivan to refuse any overtures of peace until their complete ruin was effected.
He literally wrote that their future security relied on, quote, the terror with which they chastise them.
The terror, yeah.
The sheer scale of it is staggering when you look at the numbers. They burned over 40 towns, they destroyed roughly 160,000 bushels of corn, and they intentionally forced thousands of Haudenosaunee refugees into one of the most freezing winters on record, where hundreds just starved to death.
Which is why he earned the moniker Town Destroyer from the Seneca.
Town destroyed.
It strips away any illusion of, civilized 18th century warfare.
Definitely.
He dehumanized the adversary to the extent necessary to permanently neutralize a strategic threat. The psychological burden of command required him to make choices that were utterly devoid of the high-minded Enlightenment ideals of liberty and humanity that he claimed to be fighting for.
So it's pure, ruthless pragmatism.
Exactly.
But if his absolute pragmatism allowed him to ruthlessly destroy the Iroquois, that exact same pragmatism forced him to abandon his aristocratic prejudices when it came to his own camp.
Right, it cut both ways.
Because here's where it gets really interesting in the deep dive. The sheer desperation of the war forced Washington to completely alter his 18th century Virginian worldview, particularly regarding women.
His evolution on female participation in the war effort was deeply reluctant, but highly significant.
Yeah.
To understand this, we really have to look at the massive phenomenon of camp followers.
Right. So we're talking about thousands of women who followed the Continental Army. Wives of soldiers, displaced people who lost their homes to the British, and women who were just desperate for income or food.
It was basically a moving city.
And initially, Washington absolutely hated this.
Oh, he despised it.
He wrote about them with intense aristocratic disdain. He called them a cumber and a clog upon every movement. He was constantly trying to regulate them, ban them from the wagons, and just get them out of his sight.
Because you have to remember, he was a product of a strict military patriarchy. That patriarchy viewed women in a martial setting as a nuisance, a disruption of order, and a drain on very limited resources.
Yeah.
He couldn't initially see past his class and gender biases.
But then reality hits.
Always does.
It's exactly like the invisible supply chains of modern society.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. Like, think about logistics, trucking, sanitation, the essential workers that people at the top sometimes completely ignore or look down upon until a crisis hits and they realize the whole society collapses without them.
Exactly.
Washington eventually realizes that without these women cooking, nursing, and crucially laundering clothes, his army is going to die.
Specifically of disease.
Right, typhus, which is spread by body lice and unwashed clothes. If the women aren't boiling the clothes, the army gets wiped out by typhus.
The cognitive shift there is remarkable because he goes from issuing general orders banning them to actively fighting Congress to maintain their daily rations.
Wow, quite the flip.
He realized the brutal math of the situation. If the women were driven away by starvation, his best, most veteran soldiers would simply desert to follow their families.
They just leave.
Yeah. So he had to accept women as an integrated, indispensable component of his military logistics.
And it wasn't just manual labor where his views were forced to expand. It was intellectual capability, too. The sources highlight Phyllis Wheatley, the enslaved African-American poet.
Such a fascinating interaction.
In 1775, she writes him this brilliant poem praising his leadership. Now, wait. How does an aristocratic enslaver justify inviting an enslaved black woman to his military headquarters? What is happening in his head there?
It's a moment of profound cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Washington responds to her in February 1776 with striking respect. He addresses her as Miss Phyllis.
Miss Phyllis?
He praises her poetical talents and her elegant lines, and he actually extends that unprecedented invitation to his headquarters in Cambridge.
Which is huge.
It is. Part of it may have been, the Enlightenment ideal of recognizing genius wherever it appears,
Okay.
but it also shows a real crack in his rigid worldview. Confronted with undeniable intellectual brilliance from a black woman, he temporarily suspended his deeply ingrained racial and gender hierarchies.
And you see him exploiting those same gender hierarchies when it comes to espionage.
Absolutely. The intelligence network.
Yet because the British officer corps was so blinded by their own patriarchal assumptions, they literally assumed women didn't have the cognitive capacity to understand military strategy, so they would just talk openly in front of them.
Which Washington exploited brilliantly.
Right.
He relied heavily on female operatives. Women like Lydia Dara, who listened through keyholes and actually saved American forces from surprise attacks. Or the famous Agent 355 of the Culper spy ring in New York.
Agent 355.
Their intelligence was vital, precisely because the British ignored them as non-threats. Washington recognized their utility and actively incorporated their intel into his strategy.
Plus, his reliance on his own wife, Martha Washington.
Oh, she was essential.
Because she wasn't just sitting comfortably at Mount Vernon sipping tea while he was off fighting. She spent every winter at those bleak, freezing encampments.
Dolly Forge, Morristown.
Right. She acted as a vital emotional anchor for him, managing the officers' morale, organizing fundraising, and actually copying his letters. So his view of women is forcefully expanded by the war, from this paradigm of domestic fragility to realizing they are robust, pragmatic necessities of a functioning state.
This raises an important question, though, for this deep dive.
Okay, what is it?
Because while his worldview expanded regarding the intellect and utility of women, it stands in stark, painful contrast to the deepest psychological and moral paradox of his entire life.
Which is?
Fighting a war for inalienable human rights while violently maintaining a slave empire.
Yeah, the cognitive dissonance here is just staggering. And the sources show that the Revolutionary War created the very first real cracks in his defense of slavery. But it was almost entirely driven by military pragmatism and fear, rather than some, sudden moral awakening.
The catalyst for that was Lord Dunmore's proclamation in November 1775.
Tell us about that.
So, the Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a decree offering freedom to any enslaved individuals who would abandon their patriot enslavers and take up arms for the British.
Washington was terrified by that.
Oh, he recognized it immediately as a demographic weapon aimed right at the Southern economy.
Right.
He had originally opposed enlisting black soldiers in the Continental Army. But Dunmore forces his hand. He executes a complete tactical reversal to integrate free black men and eventually enslaved men, leading to highly effective units like the Rhode Island Regiment.
The moral contradiction wasn't just coming from the British. It was being pushed on him internally by his closest military family.
Yes, his idealistic aide-de-camp, John Lawrence.
Lawrence proposed a radical plan to arm and free thousands of South Carolina slaves in exchange for their military service. And Lawrence argued forcefully that Americans couldn't contend for liberty while systematically disenfranchising enslaved people. It's just hypocritical.
And Washington's response to Lawrence is incredibly dark, actually.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
He privately supports the idea, in theory, sure, but his actual stance is deeply cynical. He tells Lawrence's father that arming slaves is a moot point because the British will just match the offer, creating a bidding war for human capital.
A bidding war.
But he also writes this chilling piece of psychological insight. He worries that if you arm some for freedom but keep the rest enslaved, it will render slavery more irksome to those who remain in it.
More irksome.
He understood exactly how evil the system was and the intense desire for freedom it suppressed.
He did. And when Lawrence's plan was ultimately rejected by the South Carolina legislature, Washington wrote to Lawrence saying that the spirit of freedom had subsided and that every selfish passion and private interest now influenced mankind.
He was profoundly pessimistic about the willingness of wealthy slaveholders to surrender their economic power for their stated ideals.
Now, I always hear this defense of Washington. People say we shouldn't judge him because he was simply a product of his time.
Right, you hear that a lot.
But I have to push back on that based on these specific sources. John Lawrence was of his time. The Marquis de Lafayette was of his time. They actively offered Washington a moral exit ramp, and he deliberately chose not to take it.
Lafayette is perhaps the most glaring example of that missed off-ramp.
How so?
Lafayette viewed abolition as the logical, necessary conclusion of the Enlightenment. He actually bought a plantation in Cayenne, down in South America, specifically to free the enslaved workers there and pay them as tenant farmers.
Wow.
And he wrote to Washington, basically begging him to join the experiment, to set the ultimate example for the new American nation.
And Washington writes back praising it.
Yes.
He calls it a generous and noble proof of your humanity, but then he just washes his hands of it. He says, quote, "But I despair of seeing it in America." He completely compartmentalizes the morality.
The dissonance is nowhere more apparent than in how he managed his own estate during the crisis of the war.
The Lund-Washington letters.
Exactly. Yeah. While he's eloquently discussing Enlightenment philosophy and human rights with Lafayette, he's simultaneously receiving logistical letters from his nephew, Lund-Washington, who was managing the enslaved workforce back at Mount Vernon.
This blew my mind when reading the source material. Right in 1776, right before the Battle of Harlem Heights, when the entire fate of the revolution is hanging by a thread, he gets a letter from Lund saying the enslaved workers are being lazy and deceitful under the overseer.
And Washington, who's currently carrying the weight of a continental war on his shoulders, erupts in profanity over his lost plantation profits.
Yes. He writes back, threatening to have them physically corrected.
Meaning whipped.
Right, whipped. Or sold to the West Indies sugar camps, which was effectively a torturous death sentence.
It perfectly encapsulates the ultimate paradox of his character. He could lament the tragedy of slavery in abstract, high-minded political discourse, but he acted as a ruthless, profit-driven authoritarian toward the human beings he considered his personal property.
It's a tough reality to sit with. So, after 8 years of this crucible, the imposter syndrome, the battlefield rage, the Machiavellian politics, the scorching of the earth, the agonizing moral hypocrisies, we finally get to the end of the war.
1783.
Right. And the ultimate test of his character wasn't actually a tactical maneuver against the British. It was what he chose to do with absolute power once he finally had it.
The Newburgh Conspiracy.
Yes.
This is the moment that truly secures his legacy as a modern-day Cincinnatus. You know, the ancient Roman statesman who was given dictatorial power, saved the Republic, and then voluntarily surrendered it to just return to his farm.
Let's set the scene for the Newburgh Conspiracy because it's cinematic. The Continental Army is encamped in Newburgh, New York. They're just waiting for the final peace treaty from Paris.
The fighting is mostly over.
Right. But the officers are furious. They haven't been paid in years. Congress is completely ignoring their pensions, and there's an anonymous letter circulating among them. It's basically hinting at a military coup d'etat against the civilian Congress.
A coup, at that moment, would have permanently destroyed the Republican ideals of the Revolution before the Constitution was even written.
It would have been game over.
America would have become a military dictatorship, plain and simple.
So Washington intervenes. He calls a meeting of the officers. He delivers this highly logical, impassioned speech, begging them not to open the floodgates of civil discord. But he looks out at the men, and the logic isn't working. The anger is just too deep.
And then comes the unscripted masterpiece of vulnerability.
Yes, tell us about the spectacles.
He finishes his prepared remarks, and he goes to read a supporting letter from a congressman. But he stumbles over the words. The text is too small.
Okay.
So he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a pair of spectacles.
Which is a big deal.
A massive deal. None of his officers had ever seen him wear glasses. In 18th century military culture, glasses were associated with extreme old age, physical infirmity, weakness.
Right.
And as he puts them on, he looks at the men and says, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country."
Oh, man. The psychological impact of that single sentence is immediate. The sources say these battle-hardened, furious men who have literally bled with him for 8 years, they just start weeping.
The mutiny collapses instantly.
Just like that.
It was an act of profound emotional intelligence. He leveraged his physical degradation to induce immense guilt and loyalty.
Wow.
By shedding that impenetrable armor of command, by exposing his frail, broken humanity instead of screaming or issuing threats, he disarmed a rebellion that pure logic couldn't touch.
And he follows that up with the Annapolis Resignation in December 1783. He travels to Congress to formally resign his commission. And the choreography of this event is so deliberate.
Very intentional.
He walks in and he bows to the seated civilian delegates. And they do not bow back. They are instructed to merely tip their hats to him. He is willingly, physically demonstrating the subordination of military power to civilian authority.
The geopolitical shockwaves of that moment were immense. When King George III over in London heard that Washington intended to simply return to his farm rather than seize power with his loyal army, he reportedly said if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world.
The sources draw a really provocative extrapolation here, looking at Washington's absolute terror of standing armies and his fierce belief in civilian supremacy. They connect it directly to today.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources argue that applying Washington's 1783 worldview strictly to the modern era reveals a massive ideological shift.
How so?
Well, the assertion in the text is that Washington would view the modern American military-industrial complex with profound alarm.
Okay, that's a strong statement.
The argument is that a multi-trillion-dollar permanent defense apparatus, intertwined with corporate lobbying and continuous global deployment, represents the exact structural reality that the Newburgh conspirators flirted with.
Right, because he viewed a standing army as a perpetual threat to liberty.
Exactly.
The source points out that Washington would be horrified by our modern cultural worship of the armed forces. You know, the way modern politicians reflexively defer to military brass, or how they treat defense spending as completely untouchable.
The author's point revolves around the intentionality of Annapolis. Washington demeaned his own military authority to ensure the uniform never eclipsed the legislative suit.
Right.
The source contends that seeing the military elevated above civilian institutions today would lead Washington to conclude that we've forgotten the core lesson of his resignation, that the military must remain the obedient, strictly regulated servant of the state, never its idol.
It really makes you wonder if our modern political culture has totally lost sight of what made that 1783 moment so revolutionary.
I think it's a fair question.
We've spent this whole time deconstructing Washington. We shattered the marble. He wasn't a demigod. He was terribly anxious. He was explosive. He ordered brutal, unforgiving things. And he was deeply compromised on fundamental human rights.
Yet his triumph came from mastering those exact vulnerabilities. His greatest victory wasn't a tactical maneuver against Cornwallis at Yorktown. It was overcoming his own ego and the temptation of absolute power.
Yeah.
He ensured the flawed republic would survive specifically by letting go of control when it mattered most.
Which leaves me with this final thought. We spent a lot of time on Washington, standing in front of his angry officers, pulling out those spectacles, using his physical vulnerability as his ultimate weapon.
Right.
But it makes you wonder, if Washington's vulnerability was his greatest strength then, could a modern leader even survive a spectacles moment today?
Oh, that's a good question.
Like, would a relentless 24-hour news cycle and social media weaponize that vulnerability, spinning it as weakness, and just destroy their career before it could ever inspire any kind of loyalty?
Yeah. Completely different landscape for leadership today, that's for sure.
It really is. Well, thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the marble, and we'll see you next time.